Hey, Jeffrey, how are you keeping?
I'm fine, thank you.
Thanks so much for joining. Very much appreciated. Jeffrey, where in the US are you actually based? And also, if you wouldn't mind, if you could give, I suppose, a brief introduction to people and tell people exactly who you are, please.
Yes, well, my name is Jeffrey Rinek. I live in a small town called Rescue, California, which is about 30 miles east of Sacramento and about 60 miles west of South Lake Tahoe. I live here with my wife, Lori. I have two grown sons. One is a professional engineer for the state. The other is a canine police officer with a local city. We've lived here for approximately 30 years now. We have always had a lot of animals, so we've got a lot of dogs and cats. Right now, because Lori and I are both in our 60s, we're down to one Great Dane and one Saint Bernard.
How cool.
And we have about 6 cats. We have 3 birds, 2 macaws, and an African gray. So at any given time, it sounds like there's a party going on in here.
That's good. That's good. And your own career, just for everyone who isn't aware of that,
Sure.
you're obviously heavily involved and heavily experienced in law enforcement.
Yes, I joined the FBI as a clerical employee in 1976. Then in 1978, I was appointed as a special agent, and I spent the rest of my time in the FBI as a special agent. I served first in the Chicago office, then the New York office for 11 years in Manhattan, and then I served my last 15 years in Sacramento, California. My wife and my wife is smarter than I am, and she knew that I did not want to live out my days in New York. I also didn't think New York was the best place to bring up our family. So we spent 8 years researching cities and visiting cities, and eventually we settled on Sacramento. And we settled here in 1991. We're very happy here, and it's been a great place for us.
Awesome.
And then my career in Chicago, I was just a brand new agent. So, new agents, you've got to make your bones, and you need to be shown. And in Chicago, my first assignment was Fugitives, the Fugitive Squad, Violent Crime Squad. My next assignment was I worked some white collar crime. And then after that, I was sent out to what they call a Title III, which is when we're monitoring phone lines.
Okay.
And this was kind of a unique case. It was called Pendorf. And if you've ever seen that movie Casino with Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci.
Yeah, one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, well, when there's like a 10-second blur where they show you a bunch of FBI agents listening with.
Yeah.
I was one of them for 13 months.
Wow. Okay.
And then after that, I transferred to the New York office where I worked more of white collar crime and foreign counterintelligence. And then in '91, we moved to Sacramento. At the time we moved to Sacramento, my oldest son became very ill and he was critically ill.
Okay.
And my wife was stronger than me in dealing with this, and it forever left a mark on my soul, I think you could say. And from that point on, I was assigned to a abduction of a 7-month-old baby in South Sacramento. I worked with a police officer, a detective named Greg Stewart. The baby's name was Frankie Proctor, and I wrote a book, and this is actually one of the chapters in the book named Frankie.
Great book. Yeah.
Thank you.
Your book, I suppose, in the Name of the Children is one of the reasons why I reached out to you. For anyone who hasn't read that book, read this book because it is absolutely fantastic.
Thank you for that. And so my son's illness in that case pretty set up the rest of my life. And I had always been an FBI agent that liked doing practical jokes, and I never really took it as seriously. But once I started working that stuff, I got very, very into it, very serious. And then from that on, the FBI started assigning me these cases. Yeah. And in the middle 90s, the director was Louis Freeh, and he determined that the FBI could be a great resource for local law enforcement working missing children.
Yeah.
And so that we started reviewing old cold cases. During this time, I was a sniper on our SWAT team.
Wow.
And I was the primary coordinator as the, you guys know it as the behavioral science or the profiling. Yeah. We call it the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime.
Yeah.
I was also, I was a co-pilot. I like flying. My wife is the adventurous one, and I got my pilot's license at her promotion. And then I also was the primary coordinator for crimes against children and an FBI program called VICAP, just, different things.
Awesome, yeah.
And all pretty much dedicated towards working missing children, and which turned into assaulted children.
Yeah, it's funny because obviously from watching Netflix, I think a lot of people have seen the Netflix show Mindhunter, which is obviously about the behavioral science unit of where they're going after the serial killers. But I mean, to be honest, I've always wanted to speak to somebody who's kind of worked in that because I think people, even in the States, but certainly from kind of people living abroad and whatever, and people, we all know the FBI and whatever, and you see it in the movies and whatever, and it's something that people kind of look at, and it's so intriguing because there's so many kind of intricacies from within the FBI of different stuff and behavioral stuff that people have to learn, and it's so fascinating.
Well, one of the great honors of my life, and it's actually on the cover of the book, is that John Douglas, who is the profiler of profilers, he wrote an endorsement of my book.
Awesome.
And I was really shocked that he even knew who I was or would do such a thing. It was wonderful.
That's brilliant.
So, since the book has come out, they really like it because the way, if I can share with you, this work really made me emotionally ill, and the emotional toll made me physically ill. And in 2006, when I retired, after I retired, I kind of was in bed for like 6 months, recovering. And then my wife asked me to tell my story to my sons and to leave something for them. And I spent about 3 months with a laptop, just typing it all out. And I was typing as if I was talking to them. And then when my wife Lori saw that, she thought it might help other investigators and first responders, sure, and even victims. And would I consider turning it into a book? And that's how it became a book. And she was absolutely right, because I've had a lot of contact from people. About a year ago, the book was published by one of your publishers in the UK. And it's been starting to do pretty well over there. So I've been called by police officers, victims. It's really been, she was really, really accurate about her thoughts. And it's an honor for me to try and honor my family by being in touch with all these people.
Absolutely. Like one of the things that you mentioned there, Jeffrey, was obviously the emotional toll that doing the kind of work that you do. I mean, look, I go into work and I get to talk to people and whatever, and I suppose there's not an emotional kind of an emotional toll that it takes on me. Whereas obviously with some of the things that somebody in your line of work has to witness and has to kind of endure, but then you have to stay strong because you've got to investigate this and you've got to try and get an end result. It must be very, very tough, and it's something that you do take home with you, whereas I suppose the rest of us are fortunate enough that we can kind of, okay, it's 5:30 or whatever, I'm clocking out now, and you kind of go home, whereas you kind of have to, if you're dealing with I suppose, kidnapped children, or I suppose deceased children, or if they're kidnapped, there's a very good possibility that they might become deceased. That's very, very high pressure, and it's very, very it must take a lot of toll on you, does it?
It does. It takes a tremendous emotional toll, but I want to say, and this is for your listeners, is that I am not unique in that. We in law enforcement, when we're looking for a missing child or we're dealing with the assault of a child, we all take it that way. And one of the things that I experienced was I developed like a second family, not only in the FBI, but among the other local investigators here in Sacramento that work these cases. So we share it, but in my case, I must say I had more exposure, and as a result of that, it took a greater toll. And in my case, and one of the reasons we put the book out there is because I don't think I was fully aware of the toll it was taking on me. I wasn't aware of what I was doing to my family.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, it made me so physically ill that I wasn't aware that I had lost some physical capacity in the makeup of my body in the form of hormones.
Okay. Yeah. Again, one of the things that you mentioned there is obviously the friendships that you actually developed with members from outside of the FBI, with other law enforcement agencies. But I suppose this was one of the questions that I was interested in, Jeffrey, because obviously you see in the movies when the FBI get called in and they're always giving out saying, oh, it's the feds are here and whatever.
Yeah.
And people are like, where they're not welcome. Whereas I'd imagine in real life, when a child goes missing and when obviously you're dealing with some very, very evil people out there who are capable of very evil acts. And when a child goes missing, the FBI obviously have some pretty amazing resources available to them. So I'd imagine that people are kind of eager to get you guys in and get as much help as possible. Is that the way versus what we see in the movies?
I think it is, but I also think it depends on the relationship between the agents in the local FBI office and local law enforcement. For instance, when I went to the Frankie Proctor case and I met Detective Stewart, their first reaction to me was, hey, thanks, we don't really need anything. But I was able to convince them that we had resources that maybe we can help them with their investigation. And from there, Detective Stewart and I developed a very close relationship and a friendship. We're friends to this day. We stay in touch because these cases are so much. And so I think what develops is initially, until they get to know you, until they get to know what you're capable of and what you'll bring to the fight, so to speak, they're a little wary because the FBI in certain places does have a bad reputation and has, in my opinion, done some things I don't agree with. But for the most part, once they know that you're there to bring the child home or find out who did this and to work with them, I think, we become accepted. There was one local agency who was very slow to call us, but by the time I retired, they not only called us, but I was invited to the retirement party of the sergeant, the homicide sergeant.
Wow,
so that was a real honor.
Cool.
So it's a good question that you asked.
Yeah. I mean, because it is very interesting, kind of the way that goes. But in terms of what actually led you into kind of law enforcement in the first place? Were your family, because oftentimes it's people who kind of had family in law enforcement and that kind of thing, but why did you go down that route? And then why did you, I suppose you kind of touched on it earlier on, but why specialize in I suppose child abductions? Was that because it was something that was, I suppose, really, did it really resonated with you because there's so much at stake versus, look, I'm not belittling stuff with, like, let's say narcotics or something like that, because it's serious as well. But at the end of the day, I mean, if you miss a drug shipment or something like that, I know that's the DEA and that, but like if you miss a drug shipment, I mean, drugs go onto the streets, but there's drugs kind of pouring into every country anyway. Whereas if you miss something with a child going missing, it's a kid's life at stake,
Well, first of all, in terms of how I got started in this, one of the things when I wrote the manuscript for the book at my wife's request, and I knew I was writing it for my sons, I shared some things that I wasn't sure how the public would react if they knew those things about me. And what I'm specifically talking about is that I was born with birth defects. I had a fairly club left foot. I walked with a limp. When I was 9 years old, my spine started curving and I had to have experimental surgery. And during the course of all this medical treatment, they discovered that I had cerebral palsy.
Mm-hmm.
So in my thinking, in my life, I never thought the FBI was something I'd be able to achieve. But after the surgery, I started walking normally. And then as I got older, I started working harder because I always wanted to be in the FBI. My father was a funeral director, and I got to see FBI agents in action when there was a funeral for a person who had been involved in organized crime. And I looked at those guys and I'm like, God, you know, that's how I'd like to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent most of my life thinking, really without believing, that I wanted to be an FBI agent. And then when it came to that point where I was applying, I wrestled, you know, do I tell them about my leg? Do I tell them about the palsy? But, you know, in 30 years, they'd never asked. So I wasn't sure how people were going to react to me after they learned that about me. But they've been really supportive. It's been really wonderful. And in my physical, you know, performances in the FBI, I was normal. I did everything just like everybody else. And that gives me a lot of personal pride. In my 60s now, I am feeling a greater effect of the palsy. It's causing an accelerated degradation of my body.
Okay.
But at least for the 30 years I was in, it was wonderful. Yeah. I loved being an FBI agent. Yeah. And then in terms of how I got into this work, my son, in 1991, when Lori and I moved to Sacramento, we had our second son in October of 1990. But when we went for our first well baby visit, we asked the doctor to look at our older son, Joe, because he seemed like he had a cold that wasn't going away, and he was gaining weight, he was always very slight. And I remember the doctor coming into the room with this ashen face and looking at us like something was really wrong. And basically, Joe had a disease called nephrotic syndrome, where the body doesn't process protein molecules, and the molecules get into the kidneys, and the tiny capillaries of the kidneys can't accept, they're too small. And it causes the kidneys to leak all of the fluids they're processing. So that weight that he put on was called edema, and he just kept getting worse and worse. And they treat it with immunosuppressant drugs. And in this case, they were using prednisone. And at one point, he got up to almost 80 milligrams of prednisone a day, which is a lot.
Yeah.
And we got to the point where the FBI said, all right, you know, you've been putting off your transfer. You either have to take it or you're going to lose it. So Lori and I got the permission of the doctors, and we started our trip to California. And we hadn't gone one day before we had to stop in Omaha, Nebraska. And again, Joe had to be hospitalized because he was so tenuous.
Yeah. And
so, Barry, this really affected me. My wife, Lori, emotionally was dealing with it better. For me, you know, like you said, I kind of hid it when I had to, but when I was alone, I felt, I don't even know how to describe how I felt. Then when I got to Sacramento and I was dispatched to this Frankie Proctor case, the thought of a child being in pain in the arms of strangers who mean them harm was just something unthinkable to me. And it drove me into this other being that I'd never experienced before.
Yeah.
And that other being, you know, was I cherished the association I had with the other agents and the law enforcement, and what we did together, working with each other, depending on each other, it made me better.
Yeah.
And because Lori likes to say I suffered a successful career, which is really accurate. I was successful, but it came at a tremendous emotional cost.
Yeah. I got you. One of the things, okay, so when I was a child, my father was involved in the car rental industry. And I remember we used to go to the international conferences would be on over in places like Orlando. And obviously Orlando is a big place where there's lots of theme parks and that. But I remember this would have been, like, I'm 35 now, so this would have been a few years after, obviously, the brutal and tragic kidnapping and murder of Adam Walsh that happened in Florida. And I remember that was something that I remember growing up, and I remember seeing that in the media. And I remember then when we went over to Florida, and I remember my parents were obviously fairly, they were obviously fairly, like, careful with us and whatever. And we'd be, I remember there was those wrist leads where obviously they'd be attached to my parents, so we couldn't wander away when we're in.
Good for them.
Yeah, I suppose it was good and whatever. But I remember one thing that resonated with me was, as a child, say you'd go into like a 7-Eleven or something like that, and you look on the side of the milk cartons, and you see the missing children over in the States. And it's something that we actually don't have over here, but it's something I remember growing up and seeing over in the States and going, and then you'd kind of hear these horror stories of, like, I don't know, different things, like people in places like Orlando where there's lots of theme parks, and you'd hear all these horror stories of kids go missing and what the abductors take kids into the toilets, and it might be a boy and they'd put a wig on the boy and then try and get it out when people are looking for a boy, and they'd get it out as a girl and whatever, trying to slip under the radar and stuff like that. Does that stuff actually go on? Or like obviously you're obviously dealing with it as a career, but like what's the most common type of child abduction? Because obviously it strikes fear in parents throughout the world.
Well, here, first of all, I'd like to say this, that because in Ireland, where you are, they don't have the flyers for missing children, it doesn't mean there aren't children that are missing.
Sure, absolutely.
And I think one of the awakenings that has occurred here in the United States that I think makes us very aggressive and progressive is that we do recognize these things happen, and we work very hard to get the child back. In terms of the statistical things, the most common thing there is a runaway of a teenager.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was shocked to learn by doing this work is how many families will force their children to leave, and we call them throwaways. There's a lot of kids out there who have no place to go, and their families put them there, and that to me is unthinkable and very hard to accept. In terms of then you're going to have, I do believe there's a high degree of child assault, but I do believe most of that comes from people that are known to the child.
Sure,
and
like parents or
position
uncles.
Of trust and confidence. Yeah. In terms of actual stranger abductions, which you're talking about, they're few and far between. There's only, I think, when I was serving this was like 13 years ago, I think the statistics I saw were there was only like a couple hundred a year in the whole country. Yeah. But it takes one, to wake everybody up.
Exactly, and those are the ones that they obviously get the media attention, because obviously I just going back to the Adam Walsh case there. Obviously, what was it? Was it Otis O'Toole? Was the guy that was responsible for that, or was it?
Yeah, I don't remember his name.
Yeah. Well, it's some psychopath anyway, and. I mean, I remember seeing the picture of that guy who confessed to doing that, and I remember looking at it going, that is the horror movie. That's what strikes fear in everybody, but oftentimes it mightn't be somebody who looks like that. It mightn't be the monster looking person that does that, because even look at the Madeleine McCann case over in Portugal there at the moment, and look at the guy who's the head suspect in that. He doesn't look like a monster,
They're not. I worked a case in 1996 in a place called Yuba City here in California, and that was a stranger abduction of an 8-year-old boy, and the crime scene of that one really, really got to me. And I read a book to be a better investigator called Without Conscience.
Okay.
It was written by Dr. Robert Hare, who's in Canada. And after being at that crime scene, I went and I got that book again to try and find some emotional comfort, because I couldn't understand how someone could do what they did to that little boy and still exist, live life, so to speak. And what I learned from his book, and what I personally believe, is that there are some people that are born without the ability to feel emotion. They can't feel. They don't have that sense of sadness. They just don't feel. And these are the people that many times that will become these killers, these serial killers or mass killers. There's a lot of people in our society who I believe are also psychopaths, as portrayed by the book. Like when you have the con man who talks a widow out of all of her life savings and goes and spends it on a good time and leaves her destitute, and it doesn't bother him. I think that's an example of a psychopath.
Or your president.
Well, we got to stay away from the political stuff. But I do. So when I'm looking at crimes and I'm looking at suspects, I'm always wondering, is that a person who's going to feel? I've become very successful at interviewing and getting confessions from people that are emotionally based. In the case of the little boy that I wrote in the book, his name was Michael. That killer not only killed Michael, but 11 years earlier, he had killed a young lady in the Bay Area. And so he's actually made him on 2 stranger abduction murders.
And both children, or was the girl?
One was an older girl who I think might have been an adult. I'm not 100% sure. Okay. And then our case here was an 8-year-old boy. And just to give you an example, I mean, there were 62 stab wounds in this little boy. He was making the boy suffer to enhance his sexual arousal. Jesus. And so as part of working crimes against children, you need to learn the thinking, the desires of these guys. And you also learn about that some of them don't really have emotion, and as Dr. Hare puts out, which I believe. And so these are things that you consider. But I think any parent that's diligent about their child's safety and researches the measures they can take and is careful, especially with the internet, you know, I think that's what it takes. It takes a parent who is willing to be knowledgeable and to interact with their children and teach them what they should and shouldn't do and how to be responsible.
Yeah, with the stranger abductions, is it a lot of the time opportunistic, or is it something where, I mean, these guys are kind of staking something out or whatever, you know what I mean?
My opinion about that is that many people, you know, Barry, I don't know whether you're married, whether you have a partner or whatever.
Nobody will take me, Jeffrey. Nobody will take me.
Well, I think don't get...
One day.
We'll find somebody out here. It's my opinion that many offenders are themselves victims.
Yeah.
And that if you look at the age that they were victimized, you will be able to see of the age of their preferred victim. Now, having said that, I also believe that children that are victimized many times will grow up to be offenders.
Yeah.
And what happens, in my opinion, is that we'll talk about a male sexual offender develops a fantasy, a sexual fantasy. And where you and I, our fantasy of like winning the lottery would be paying off our bills and buying what we want. The fantasy of a person who is sexually motivated is extremely detailed. I mean, detailed down to the room, the color of the room, the carpet, everything you can imagine there. And they live every day of their life with this fantasy in their mind and wanting to see this fantasy through. A small minority of these people will commit to carrying out their fantasy even though it's illegal. The example in my book would be the Yosemite murders case, where you have Cary Steynar, who started fantasizing about having relationships with 11, 12-year-old girls, and his fantasy would always include murdering their guardian and then murdering the girls. So I believe...
Sorry to cut across you there, but no, the interesting thing about that one, and that's a case that I remember watching, like I remember before I even knew that we were told that we were going to be talking, I remember looking into that case, and that one was a fascinating case because Kerry Steiner, his brother had been abducted from the age of 7 to 14, if I'm correct, and he was actually sexually molested himself. Like the brother, and then the brother unfortunately passed away. But you'd think, looking as an outsider, you'd think that somebody who's had that happen to a member of their family, and you'd think that they would have some kind of an empathy for something like that, and that they'd be the last person to carry out such an act. But I found that fascinating that the brother went on and he was a serial killer who killed he killed four or five people, didn't he?
He killed 4 women, yes. And he confessed to me and my partner John Bowles, we had this opportunity to ask him anything and everything. I have a special way that I do my interviews. I don't have a technique, so to speak. I absorb little things from everybody I work with. And the way I do my interviews now is that if you take Kerry as an example, first I'll ask him to run through a narrative, almost like an outline of what he's done. And then I'll use that as my outline, and I'll go back again. And this time I'll question him in tremendous detail about what he saw, what he touched, what he smelled, what he thought, what he felt. And then I'll go back again and we'll do it again. But this time, because he's the last one to have seen our victim, I want to know from him, what did he observe the victim saying or doing, or what was painful, things like that. And then we'll go back again, and this time I'll say, I am a third person in the room. I'm watching you do what it is that you're doing. What am I going to see? And then we go through extreme detail with that. And then the final thing I do is I ask the person who's confessing to write a letter of apology to the victim. And I can tell you that I've never observed a letter of apology that's been written that didn't show me something I missed in the interview.
Really?
And so I think all these things together work to try and get as complete a story as you can. And when it comes to his brother, he was pretty shaken up. In fact, that's one of the things we talked about that I think helped him decide he wanted to share with me what he had done.
Okay. And when you go into these interviews with some of these guys who've committed atrocious acts and incredibly violent crimes, in the case of Cary Steynar, where he killed a mother and a daughter and an Argentinian girl who was over in the US learning English, if I remember correctly. And then I believe that there was another a naturalist that was
You're
killed.
correct.
Yeah, but in terms of when you're dealing with some of these guys and when you're interviewing them, is there a case sometimes where you're dealing with their egos? And where, like, because again, I know I'm kind of going back to, you see this in the movies, but a lot of the times, like you've heard with serial killers, I'm going back to, say, Ted Bundy. He was obviously an egomaniac, and he was somebody who, I mean, he wanted to be in control all the time when he was being interviewed by law enforcement, and it was nearly like a game of cat and mouse for him. Again, the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, he was, again, somebody who was nearly on an ego trip, who was playing a game with law enforcement within the interview. Is that often the case, or is that just for a very, very specific type of serial killer or offender?
I think that goes back to the discussion about psychopaths. I think that if you're interviewing a person who's a psychopath, and you're not going to be able to convince them that what they did was wrong or hurtful or harmful, or they should address it. So in that case, I think where the psychopath, what he may take pride in the reality that he was able to escape justice for so long. And sometimes if you appeal to that, that's what will get him to talk. The final guy that interviewed Ted Bundy was a guy named Bill Hagmeyer, who I know, and was an FBI agent. And he was actually the unit chief for the behavioral science. A really wonderful, remarkable, emotional, passionate person. And I do believe that when Bundy was at the point of his execution, he did share with Bill many of the things he did. But I think that was because of the fear he had of his execution. I don't think he felt bad. And Bill, to his credit, did exactly what he should have done to make him feel like he could talk to him.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. And in terms of, I suppose, going back to Kerry Steiner, how did you guys actually end up catching him? Just out of interest. I mean, was that a case that you actually, you obviously worked it if you were interviewing him, but like how involved were you in kind of the arrests of Cary Steynar?
Well, if you read my book, there's actually 2 chapters on that, and I go into it in very detail because there's a lot of controversy about Cary Steynar. The FBI, when working these cases, because of the notoriety of the case and all of the media attention, the case was being run by the head of our office himself, who didn't have the experience base. He had not worked that many cases like this. And his philosophy of the reason for the murders was that it was 2 guys that are looking to kill and rob tourists. If you look at the crime scene pictures, it appeared that, at least I believe there was something more, possibly sexual. But as time went by, I started out in charge of that case, but I eventually was removed. And by the time it was spring and summer of 1999, I had extricated myself totally, and I was back home with my family. In July, on July 24th, I got a call here to meet 2 of my partners to go down and pick up this guy at a nudist colony. And it was Cary Steynar.
And did you know that? And did you know that that he was guilty at that stage, or
No.
no? Okay, okay.
We were told that he was a witness and that he was running in fear. Might have been a boyfriend of the last victim. When we picked him up, we didn't pick him up to interview him or anything. We were told just to pick him up like a taxi company and bring him to the FBI office in Sacramento so he could be interviewed there. So we went down there. I knew, as you previously pointed out, about Kerry's brother, Stephen. And because that's the kind of work I did, I wanted to know from him how his family felt law enforcement had dealt with them. And I wanted to learn from him what we in law enforcement could do to be better for the families. So as it happened, the car I was driving was a 2-door car. So Kerry agreed to be transported to our office to be interviewed. And he rode with me, and it should have been a 45-minute drive. It turned out to be a 90-minute drive because of road construction. And during that time, Barry, we just got to know each other. We were 2 guys thrown together on a summer Saturday. Neither one of us really wanted to be there doing that, but we were stuck together, so we made the best of it. We talked about camping and hiking through Yosemite. I talked about how that's the last thing in the world I'd want to do, that my idea of camping was an air conditioner, a bed, and a TV. And so we laughed about that. I talked to him, we talked about his brother. I wanted to know, what could we have done better for your family? And what he said is that his brother was held for 7 years by these offenders. And yet the offender, his name was Kenneth Parnell, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. I mean, is that fair? And that's an example where I think nowadays we've become better at recognizing certain things. And then he said, when Stephen came home, because he came home, the world thought that the Steynar family lived happily ever after, but they didn't live happily ever after. Stephen came home, he had proclivities for things that were not in line with the family's life structure. He was, smoking cigarettes, he was smoking dope, he was living a very reckless life. And eventually, when he's in his 20s, he got involved in a car accident where he was killed. The driver of the accident, who killed Stephen, fled to Mexico after the accident. He ran. And when they brought him back, they charged him with what we call a misdemeanor, which is a very shallow type of crime, and then let him go. And Kerry, he was emotional about this. He felt really, really like this affected his family in a bad way. I agreed with him. I asked him, if his family had gotten counseling. I told him because of the work I was doing, I had contacts with chaplains. Maybe I could help his family or help him. And so we talked about these things, and we also talked about the reality that when a family goes through the loss of a child or some type of event, it's a tremendous wound. I know my wife Lori and I, when our son was sick, that still rides with us. But if things go well, and if people help you, then that wound becomes a scar, and you never forget it or lose sight of what it was in your life, but you go on living your life and you have the scar there. And this is a concept of closure that I believe in, that I described to him. And then, also on the ride, there's a movie here that came out in the 70s. It was kind of like this little sleeper cult movie called Billy Jack, about a Native American who was a veteran of the Vietnam War, but he was also a martial arts expert. And in the movie, he goes back to his southwestern USA town, which is corrupt, and he uses his martial arts skill to fight for justice. And I loved it. But Kerry looked exactly like the character Billy Jack. And I asked him while we were driving, you ever see Billy Jack? He's like, no, never saw it. Barry, I must have asked him 4 or 5 times, and he denied it every time. And then as we were pulling into the FBI parking lot, he looked at me and recited the famous line from that movie. So he had seen it, and he knew exactly what I was talking about. So, he laughed, I laughed, and, it was like this moment.
I wonder why you did that.
I think he was playing with me. I think he wasn't sure he wanted to be friends with me, or whether I don't know. I think he was assessing me. Let me put it in those terms.
And do you think that, obviously you spent extensive time with this man, would this man, because we all have these ideas of what kind of monsters these guys are. Is this guy passable for normal? If you meet this guy in the street?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Very handsome, very bright. There's nothing about him. Now, later, as we were doing our investigation, we found there were certain things in his life that would cause him to be of notice. But for the most part, if you met him, you wouldn't think there was anything, unusual about him. Yeah. He was 6 foot. He was in great shape. He's very bright, very handsome. I look at a guy like that and I'm like, why can't I have a full head of hair? Why can't I look like that? Why can't I have that? But
do you think that we often see these documentaries about serial killers, and it's like, are they born like that, or are they made like that from circumstances within their lives? Do you think if what happened to his brother Stephen Steynar hadn't happened to him, do you think that this man would have gone on to become a serial killer?
Yes. With Kerry, when we got him back to the office, we weren't sure what to do with him. We had no direction. We were told he was a witness, and we had no idea. We had no information about the case. And our boss, who was running everything, eventually told me to go in and interview him. Well, we had taken him away from his breakfast, and we were all had started very early in the morning. So I ordered out pizzas for everybody. Oh, and I also, John Bowles and I decided that because we had no idea what to interview him about, that we would ask our polygraph guy to come in, because he was great and he would interview him for a polygraph, and then we would not have to try and figure it out. So at one point, the polygrapher Harry showed up along with the pizzas. They showed up at the same time, and John came in and told Kerry that the pizzas were there and the polygrapher was there. Which did he want to do first? And Kerry looked at John and said, well, let's skip the polygraph. I want to talk to Jeff alone. And I know it's not a funny thing to hear that, but it is in my life, because people, for some reason, people feel this compulsion to confess to me. And this is not the first time we've had somebody say, you know, I want to see Jeff alone. Mm-hmm. And it had gotten to the point where whenever someone said it, you know, we'd roll our eyes, everybody would roll our eyes, and I'm like, oh my God. And the joke about me is that I am so emotional, I'm so empathetic and passionate, that when I am interviewing someone, usually with the confession, the offender will come out, you know, in tears, and I'll come out in tears, because it's hard to hear these things without being emotionally impacted. Yeah. So when Kerry said he wanted to see me alone, at this point, we knew something was not as it should be. Uh-huh. And when I did see him alone, he explained to me that he could give me closure on why we were there, which I took to mean a confession about this latest woman. And then he had said more. And eventually the more turned out to be Carol, Julie, and Sylvina. And so my partner, other partner, Ken Hagmeyer, who we call Hitman, he was the supervisor on the scene in the office that day. And he had Kerry and I move to a room that could be audio and video monitored. And John, when he brought the pizza to us, I asked him to stay, because John was my partner, close friend, very bright. And it always makes me feel better when there's someone who I trust and is comfortable with, and I know will be smarter than I am. And John is that guy. And because of our friendship, we were able to do a great job. And then, as I told you, I used the way I interview, and we went through 6 hours of Kerry confessing. No one knew or expected that he was responsible for the first 3 murders. I learned when I was being cross-examined in court that my boss had been told that he was most likely a suspect in the 4th murder, but for reasons unknown, he chose not to tell John, Ken, or I about that. So I was put in to interview a guy who was known to be a murderer and not told. So that's always kind of resonated with me. Yeah. But we spent 6 hours. We got full description of the crimes he had done. And you'd be amazed at, with victim families, you can't undo the harm, the loss, but sometimes with understanding and sometimes with the realization that others can learn or benefit, I'm not saying it eases the pain, but it gives a reason.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I listen, just in terms of, I've only got 3 more questions, because I'm conscious with time as well. But in terms of, my first question is, in terms of when I think of an FBI agent that's in the line of work that you're doing, or even people who are working on different, I've talked to guys who work on things like the Mexican drug cartels and things like that, but doing things like child abductions and serial killers. When you're walking around and when you're walking amongst society, like, are you looking at the world through different eyes? Because, like, I'm walking around, and I think sometimes when you're not involved directly with some of these, and you become so caught up in your own life, and that you kind of, I think we're all a little bit innocent to what can be beside you and how close we are, and we're living amongst evil a lot of the time. Do you look at the world through different eyes?
Barry, you're a good interviewer, and so I'm going to confess something to you. First of all, yes, I'm very cynical about people. I don't look at anyone without wondering. And I got to the point where I didn't want my children going out. I didn't want my wife going out. I have no trust of anyone. I am now living as kind of a recluse. It's kind of a family joke, but given my options, I will stay home and not go out all the time. I'm very content not going out. And I've learned from some of my friends who have done this work that they've become the same. We just like being at home. And I think it's just less sensory overload when we go out. And I also know, and we didn't have time to talk about it, but there have been many, many nights where I have woken up in my wife's arms crying because of the nightmares that I have from what I've seen. So for me, I just try and live a very calm, peaceful, quiet life.
Do you
And
suffer? Do you suffer from PTSD? Because like I talked to a guy who works with Vice, the media company, called Ben Anderson, a British guy, and he's a war correspondent. And Ben went over. He's been in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and some of the stuff that this man has seen. Like when I interviewed him, like I'm speaking to you now, I got a sense from Ben that like this has taken an enormous toll on him. Is that's the same for you, I'd imagine, is it?
yes, I've been told that I am a poster child for PTSD. I got so bad that in around 2005, I had a new boss, Drew Pereni, who called me into his office because the new director, his name is Robert Mueller, he had been was talking about cutting back on crimes against children. And he wanted to know my feelings about it. And I was expressing to him, based on my experience, why I thought it would be a good idea to cut back on these things. And apparently, the fact that I wasn't doing well stood out to him because he looked at me, and for the first time in my career, first time ever in the office, he looked at me, he goes, "How are you doing?" And I told him that I didn't think I was doing well. You know, I got very glassy-eyed, and I was especially concerned about what I had done to my family because my family had been put through a lot because of me. And he promised me to get me all the help I needed. And I promised him that I would retire in a year and not get any more confessions, which I didn't honor my promise. I ended up getting some more. But it was nice to know that he cared. And he sent Lori and I'm very, my wife, I live for my wife. I live for Lori. And he sent Lori and I down to San Bernardino, California, and we spent a week there with the counselor. And in the 5 days of going into the counselor's office, we never got past briefing the cases I had worked. And so there were so many of them that she told me that alone wasn't normal. And I think one of the reasons I live the life I do is because I don't want to be I don't want my emotions to be activated. And in spite of anything, you know, sometimes they are. But I think that's part of the toll.
No, I got you. And
now, I want to tell you, Barry, before you cut off, that if you do have any law enforcement that are listening, you know, I tried to take my life twice. And I've been called by another police officer who was in the process of planning his. And, you know, I can tell you that, number one, to do that is extremely selfish and not fair to your family.
Yeah.
And the police officer that called me, he's realized that, and he's, I think, having a better life. So I want to be clear to your listeners that this is not something that happens in your life, and you know, it's not like the movies where you go home and you celebrate life.
Yeah, no, listen, I I completely understand that, and I'm sorry to hear that you've gone through that, Jeffrey. I really am. I genuinely am, and I hope you're in. I hope you're in. I suppose a little bit more of a positive place now.
I am. My wife retired in 2018, and I can tell you with no reservation that since she retired and we spend every day together, it's the happiest time of my life.
You seem like a family man, which is a good, which is a good thing, and I suppose that's the important things to stick around stuff, right? Because that's the only thing that matters, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. We're at a point now where we have our first grandson who's 3 years old. We have two more grandchildren on the way in January and April of 21. So when I look at my family and I look at what Lori and I have done, it makes me very, very proud.
Yeah, good, and that's good to hear. Listen, the last two questions, and
Yes.
you'll guess the second one when you hear the first one. But I suppose I want to end on a positive. So I suppose the first one is probably going to be a little bit of a negative one in terms of what was the hardest case that you worked on in your career?
You know, Barry, I got to tell you, and I apologize for not sharing this with you
Sure.
before. That's not a good question to ask me, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
I think we do this work for victims.
Sure.
We want to help victims.
Yeah.
And to distinguish one case from another by virtue of being fired or whatever, you're telling one victim that they were less important. So they were all equally important to me, and there's nothing more important to me than the victims we're serving. And I can tell you one of the things I am proud of is that many of the victims from the cases I've worked are still in touch with my family and me right now as we speak.
Good. And that's completely understandable. Is there any case where you can remember as being like something like I know the case that I know the case I saw something about you on Netflix. I can't remember the name of the show where you got the 8-month-old child back to the parents. Yes. Like, is there any cases like that where against all odds, because oftentimes, like, if a child's missing for the first, once it goes over 24 hours or something, don't the chances of the child returning alive diminish drastically, don't they?
I do believe that as time goes by, your chances diminish, but I also have worked cases that are old that we've been able to solve. So
yeah.
I think, you know, to go back to your question about the cases are each individual and they're unique. And I think one way you can segregate them from each other is based on the crime scenes we dealt with. So for instance, some of the crime scenes are much, much worse than others and live in my mind, plays them like a video.
Yeah.
In one case, I was with another FBI agent, and we had learned that when a mom calls in to say that their child's missing, the first place we start looking is their home. And in this case, the other agent picked up a lid to a trash can, and there we saw 2 little feet that were upside down. So the mom had killed her child. So, you know, yes, these things stay in my mind because of the brutality of the crime scene. And so these are the things that I think ride me. And then if I can have one more minute.
Of course, you can have as many minutes as you like.
You know, in my last year of service, I was interviewing a 19-year-old boy who had killed a 15-year-old boy. And as I told you, I do my interviews differently. I like to look for value.
Yeah.
And in his 19-year-old boy who had brutally murdered a 15-year-old boy. And during the course of the interview, I said, if you could have anything in the world, what would you want? And he looked at me and he said, I would want someone to love me, and I would want someone to love. Wow. So it never ceases to amaze what some of these people are feeling and will say. And so that is the most important. If anything gets across to your listeners, many of these people that commit these crimes are themselves victims. Yeah. And the fact that they're victims is what altered their life. And so I don't see them as monsters. I don't see them as terrible people. The ones that are psychopaths and don't feel, that's a different story.
Sure.
But people that are fighting that suffering from what they went through as a child, it's very hard to experience that and not feel something for them.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, and I understand that, and I suppose human beings are so complex, and trying to draw and say, right, this case and that case, you're dealing. There's so many intangibles, and there's so many different things that just set human beings apart, and there's different circumstances. It's so hard to.
Yes, I believe everybody has something to offer, even the most unlikely candidate. For instance, if you go to a homeless person living on the street, they know more than you do about living on the street and how to survive.
I bet they do.
They have the value of explaining that to you. And that's one of the things I love about people is people are so unique and so different that it's in the differences that you learn.
Yeah, for sure. And listen, for anyone who's listening, I mean, if you didn't believe me before from talking to Jeffrey, you need to read the book In the Name of the Children. It's an absolutely fantastic book, and it's definitely worth the read. Unfortunately, we can only cover so much, but I've really enjoyed speaking to you, Jeffrey. I think you're from speaking to you, you're a good guy. You're somebody who, I can see the sincerity from talking to you. You're a family man, and I mean, listen, I wish you the very best of luck for the rest of your life.
Thanks for reaching out and contacting me. It's been wonderful.
Hey, it's been a pleasure, and I'll get the link over to you shortly as well. And pleasure speaking.
My pleasure as well.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.